When it comes to progressive organizing, the 2020 election revealed major power on the grassroots level and some serious blind spots from the top. That is especially true when it comes to the LatinX community, whose voters were a major focus for both parties. Chuck Rocha is a progressive political organizer whose message helped reach the Latinx community across the United States, and his wisdom will help Democrats win future elections if they listen. Here now to discuss, Chuck Rocha, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You are a preeminent Latino vote expert. You are the president and founder of Solidarity Strategies, a New York Times op-ed contributor, and the author of the debut memoir, Tío Bernie, which gave an inside look at the strategy behind the historic Latino outreach operation that you pioneered on Bernie's 2020 campaign. Do you have any discomfort having to move from Bernie's 2020 campaign to a more generalized Democratic strategy position?
I think I probably have a little bit. I think it's because I have a little bit of anxiety because with Bernie, I got to help run the show. So it's a lot better and you have a lot more fun when you're in charge of the staff, the budget, decision-making, instead of just being one little pebble in an ocean of a bunch of pebbles. So yeah, I had a lot more say-so on what happened with the Latino vote. And I think that the results speak for itself, not just based off of my success, but the success of 200 young Latinos that we hired on the staff for Bernie Sanders.
You're known for organizing the Latino community politically and especially for progressive change. Can you talk about that journey and how you were able to mobilize these voters across the U.S.?
Yeah, and it's almost the reason I wrote the book, because I wanted to do an open source memo to all Democrats, all progressives, to finally answer the question and no longer have to hear that, Chuck, Latinos are great and all, but they just don't vote. I wanted to prove that if you'll invest in them and if you'll show up in their neighborhoods and if you will spend money on them as if they were a white persuadable voter, they'll vote at the same levels and they will show up. And if I can get them to vote for a man you wouldn't think would generally be a Latino champion, a white Democratic socialist from Vermont who's 79 years old, if I can get them to vote for Bernie Sanders, you should be able to give them to vote for Chuck Rocha in East Texas. But it starts with going and having a conversation and starting early.
Chuck, talk about what in Bernie's campaign really resonated with Latino voters.
I think us showing the respect to the community. Policy wonks wants to say, well, what is the issue that's driving the Latinos to Bernie Sanders? Well, half of the problem and half of the solution is actually showing up in the neighborhoods, opening up an office in their neighborhood, and then starting talking to them prior to just 2 weeks before the election, when most politicians show up in our neighborhoods and start saying, hey, come vote for this Democrat or that Democrat because we love you. And we're going to do this one little campaign commercial in Spanish and then just talk to you about immigration. With Bernie Sanders in Nevada, for example, we showed up 8 months in advance. We put our headquarters in the heart of the barrio in the middle of East Las Vegas. And then we started talking about Bernie's immigration story, his stance on the minimum wage, what it would mean to you to get Medicare for all, and what free tuition in public universities would mean to a family. And they flocked to him after we showed up in the right ways in the beginning.
But it does seem like Bernie's policies made it a little easier. It's not like if you went there and you're like, we're going to deregulate the banks and let them go crazy on Wall Street, that the community would be like, it doesn't seem like you could just show up with any candidate. And as long as you paid attention to that community, that would work.
Well, that's true, but there's also part of that that's not true. And let me make the point for that. People need to remember that the average age of a Latino in America is only 26 years old. Most of us have not been here that long. And that means that we have less information and there's not a history of voting like there is in the African American community. Do you want to know why Donald Trump did so much better with Latinos? Not that he won the Latinos, but he did do better than any Republican had ever done with Latinos up until the George Bush number, is because he spent real money to go talk to Latinos and lie to them about what he was doing. And he spent enough money on them to where he got 12 extra points in Miami-Dade, 22 extra points in the Texas Valley, when there wasn't a competitive issue argument from the Democrats saying, no, that's wrong. We stand for the minimum wage. We stand for everything Donald Trump stands against. So if you only have one side of the argument and you show up in those neighborhoods, you can actually get a little more of the vote than you've ever gotten before.
Do you think Democrats are paying attention to what you've done and what you are recommending, which is obviously more outreach?
I think the answer is yes and no. I think President Biden did a good job. Did he do a great job? No, nobody's done a great job. But he did a good job reaching out to Latinos. But then in return, the super PACs, who spent $1 billion by October, spent less than 2% of all of that money talking to Latinos. So again, you see a lesson being learned by the Biden administration that they had to learn from the primaries, where they took the Bernie Sanders approach, spent a lot of money, put a lot of people out there. The super PACs are still hyper focused on trying to get white Republicans to move from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And then at the congressional level, there was a great drop off in communication to Latinos, where the 9 congressional seats that Democrats lost, 5 of them are majority people of color. That should be unheard of in Democratic politics.
Chuck, you are the Stacey Abrams of the U.S. Latino vote.
I wish I was Stacey Abrams in any form or fashion. That sister is an American hero. I've just been working really, really hard and making lots of mistakes over a long period of time, to where I use real basic Mexican redneck philosophy on how you do this. Well, how about if you show up and ask folks to vote for you and tell you how you're going to make their lives better? And guess what? They will show up for you. We proved that with Bernie Sanders.
Oh, it's wonderful. What do you make of Joe Biden's nomination of a person from the Latino community whose name is escaping me right now as head of who's going to be in charge of immigration policy?
Mayorkas. He is going to be amazing. So he's a Cuban immigrant, right? So think about this. As much of us being the Latino activist community, hate everything about ICE and everything about this organization. If you have to have an organization like this and have it doing the real things it should be doing, which is not putting kids in cages, why not put a Democratic Cuban immigrant who's lived an immigrant experience into this office? That's why I think elections matter. I think that's why these appointments matter. And I think that if you're a Latino and you're looking at representation and why representation matters, I think this brother's going to be really good at what he's doing. Alejandro knows what it's like to be an immigrant and to come here. Is coming here from Mexico and Guatemala different than coming here from Cuba? It's still an immigrant experience, and I'm glad that he's there.
I too am glad that he's there, and I'm a first generation immigrant from Southern Italy. It's a whole different thing, but it's very much the same. Right. I keep trying to convince my Italian brethren to remember that their families are also immigrants. Like when I go to Staten Island and they have different opinions than I do about immigration policy. Anyway, recent data on the coronavirus crisis shows that while the Latino community has been hit disproportionately, Latino people are not receiving the vaccine at the same rates as white people. How can we best advocate for this community to receive the healthcare they need right now?
I think it starts with understanding that Latinos don't consume information the same way that white people do. It kind of goes back to our political problem. There's a way to communicate Latinos that this is safe and this is where you get it. And here are some of the resources available to you. But many of our community, up to 40% of our community, only communicate in Spanish. So if we're not out telling people about what coronavirus is doing, how you get tested, how you get the vaccine in Spanish, many of them are in this black media hole where they're not seeing it. You couple that with being in communities that are probably deserts when it comes to having a drugstore or having a big supermarket where they're giving away these shots. You see that in poorer neighborhoods, black, brown, Asians, and poor white neighborhoods, that's where the least amount of people are getting vaccinated. So we have to be, what I like to say, is very intentional about how we do that organizing. It's much like what we did with Bernie, is go in language, which means Spanish, English, and bilingual, and do a multi-layered approach to talk to them. Why don't you text them on their cell phone and tell them where they could go get this? Why don't you run an ad on the internet? Why don't you run a radio commercial on that Spanish station that everybody listens to in that town who happens to be Latino? Those are the ways that I talk to Latino voters. That's the same way we could be getting them educated on COVID.
My understanding is that right-wing media is trying to buy into Spanish radio stations, Latino media, and that was some of that is responsible for what happened in Miami-Dade. What are your thoughts about what the progressives need to do in order to, I don't know, stave that off or compete with it or what?
I've been doing campaigns for 31 years, and I saw a lot of misinformation over my lifetime. And let's all be very clear that it's not new. It's always happened, but it happens now at such a rapid rate and on a much bigger scale, to where the first time, I think, in my history, I saw it dramatically affect elections in Miami-Dade and a few other places. So what happens in Spanish is you don't have a lot of people reporting misinformation in Spanish, because you don't have the people who are policing this and pushing back on this listening again in Spanish. So these Spanish DJs, these Spanish language YouTubers, and folks that are just lying to our community have no one to push back or even to report them, because they're doing it in Spanish. And when you get to a place like Miami-Dade, where you have Cubans and Central Americans and Venezuelans who are all communicating only in Spanish, you see this having a dramatic effect. And the way you push back on that is you have people on those programs pushing back in real time and running advertisements again in Spanish, saying these people are lying to you. You vote on this day, you have these rights, and what they're doing is just right-wing propaganda.
Oh gosh, I wonder if the Democratic machine or the progressosphere can actually, they've been just in general pretty horrendous on making sure that there's a media that there's a media atmosphere that promotes progressive ideas. Do you see any hope in this area?
I do. I think that you have to get tougher. We did a bunch of focus groups last summer with infrequent voting Latino men. And this is where a real problem is. We lost a lot of these infrequent Latino men to Trump because of his bombastic nature. And there's a real machismo attitude with Latinos. Some, like old school Italians, I would even say, is that culture, right? So we have to figure out how you talk to them. There's one thing that we did with Bernie Sanders when we talked to these particular folks, which was talk about the rigged system. These guys, these men, these machismo men are angry, but they're basically angry for the same reason that left-wing progressive like me are angry, is that the system is rigged towards the rich. And then if you're working class, you do not get the benefits of somebody with a lobbyist and a bunch of lawyers. So that's the way Bernie Sanders in the Texas Valley talked to these Latinos. We have to push back against the system to make sure that there's representation for working class people. And that's why Bernie Sanders won all of those counties along the Texas Rio Grande Valley that Donald Trump so overly performed in.
Are you hopeful about Biden's ability to make progressive change on immigration as president? And how should activists push him to act on these issues?
I do have faith, and it comes from this angle, is that I would much rather be having this argument with a group of Latino activists in the immigration activist space than with Donald Trump. And I've watched Joe Biden, who hasn't had a sterling perfect record on immigration, but has been saying all the right things. And for God's sakes, he put a bust of Cesar Chavez behind his office. Now, a bust is a bust, and art is art. But I'd say I'd rather have a conversation with that dude who hired 3 of my friends who are immigration activists in his comms department, in his policy department, who I know have been out protesting with me at the Supreme Court and other places. Yeah. Are we going to align on 100%? No, but I bet I get a lot closer to 90 than I do to 0, which is where I was at with Donald Trump.
We're speaking with Chuck Rocha, preeminent Latino vote expert and president and founder of Solidarity Strategies. Chuck, final words to people who are watching, final words about what you think people who are watching need to know about the rising population of Latino voters that we have in the country.
2 big things. One is, what do you call us? Folks say Latino, folks say Hispanic, some people say Latinx.
I was going to ask you that.
Some people say Chicano, some people say Tejano. All of the things that I just said to you are all correct. It all depends how somebody approaches you. There's a new term, Latinx, that there's a lot of debate around. It's because it's non-gender conforming, which is cool if that's the way you want to be conduced, because in Latin, Latino defers to the male side of that, which is the O in group settings. So if that's the way you want to be identified when I start a conversation, then I return that. I go with Latino because I find it to be the most broad. But in New Mexico, they like Hispanic. They come from Spain and in other places. So it's find out where you are regionally, find out what your person you're having a conversation with, and ask them up front. They really will appreciate if you say, how would you like to be self-identified? And then the second piece that people need to know is always remember country of origin when you're thinking about Latinos, because folks who come from Puerto Rico and Cuba or the Dominican Republic are much different than from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and they're all Latino on the voter file, but they could not be more different culturally because of their country of origin. Always keep that in mind.
Chuck, do you find that they are, in addition to being different culturally, do you find that they are different politically?
Oh my God, yes. So the whole reason Donald Trump won Miami-Dade is because almost all the Cubans down there are registered as Republicans. And that's just how they've always been. They're very conservative, but the younger Cubans are registering as no party preference and some as Democrats. So we have some opportunity. And just up the street 4 hours in Orlando, the Puerto Ricans who live in Orlando in the same state are almost all Democratic. So you have two groups of Latinos in the same state, 4 hours from each other, who act totally politically different when it comes to voting.
Gee, Chuck, it seems like they need to make a whole bunch of you, at least 50, one per each state.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the program. I really appreciate it. You can find Chuck on Twitter at Chuck Rocha, Rocha, and also on the website Solidarity Strategies. Thanks so much, Chuck. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
You're watching Act TV. I'm Julianna Forlano. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and I will see you here tomorrow.